Now, what about specifically genetics and nutrition? I think that's a fascinating area. I didn't really appreciate how in depth that field was. But when did you really get into the genetics of nutrition?
Well, that came about while I was doing my PhD. And one of the experiments that I conducted, the results were the complete opposite of what another research group had found. And we were looking at the effects of cholesterol on colon cancer and breast cancer in animal models. And, I thought I'm a new graduate student. I must have messed up the experimental diets or, screwed up the study somehow. And so I went back through everything very carefully and saw that, things were done right. And when I compared our study with the previous work that was done, everything was the same except for the strain of mouse that was used. And so basically, it's just the genetics of the animal that was different. So we repeated the experiment and did a kind of a head-to-head comparison between the strains, and sure enough, found that depending on the genetics of the animal, the response is the complete opposite. So that's when the kind of light bulb went off and said, I thought to myself, wow, if two different mice can respond differently, then surely, two humans can respond differently based on their genetics. And this was around the time, so this was the late 90s. Just around the time when, we were going through the Human Genome Project. It was published a few years later. And there was a lot of interest and excitement in genomics and genetics. And then I went to Harvard and worked with one of the very few researchers in the world at the time who had integrated genetics into her nutrition studies. And so I trained with her in that. At the time, even the term nutrigenomics wasn't even coined yet. And then when I started my research program at the University of Toronto in the year 2000, I established a research program that looks at the interactions between nutrition and our genetic makeup.
Hmm. So this is really the cutting edge of your specialty. When did that really begin? Was that the early 2000s?
Yeah, so that's when I got my first faculty position and started doing my own research. It was then in 2006 when we published our landmark study in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. So this year actually marks that 15-year anniversary of our first big study, where we showed that depending on how people metabolize caffeine, coffee could either be good for them or bad for them. And so that was really kind of what put our research group on the map.
Yeah, and well, let's get to that. And I was going to talk about that a little bit later on, but now that we've kind of brought it up, I think it's a great segue into this point. I've heard you talk about the point of heterogeneity of people and how they respond to food, and I think it's a really astute point to make because um, when people look at food and how foods react differently to different people, or people kind of have different responses to different types of foods, and how even studies can sometimes show completely opposite findings, or at least different findings with respect to the effects of coffee, for instance, the effects of chocolate, the effects of wine and alcohol. Can you explain that phenomenon of why you can have studies that show different findings, but they're not necessarily invalid?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is something that has kind of plagued our field of nutrition. Unfortunately, you tend not to see this in other disciplines, but the apparent inconsistencies among studies, right? We do often hear, sometimes in the newspaper we read that a study comes out showing that coffee is good for us. A year later, another study will come out and say coffee is bad for us, and yet another year, coffee doesn't do anything. And those inconsistencies are partly due to these studies being done on different populations with different genetics. And some people metabolize caffeine very efficiently and they get rid of it from their system pretty rapidly. So for them, the caffeine in the coffee just doesn't stick around very long to do anything. And if anything, they actually benefit from the other substances in coffee, like antioxidants and polyphenols that actually have beneficial effects. So again, just depending on the genetics of the individual, or in some cases, populations, if you're just comparing results of studies done in different parts of the world, you're going to come up with different conclusions. And again, this has been somewhat frustrating. I know for not only consumers and the public who want to know how to eat better, but even for, or maybe even especially for researchers and clinicians, right? How do we weigh the evidence from two very well-designed studies, but that come to very different conclusions just because they were done in different parts of the world? And so this is really what our research strives to do, which is to reconcile those differences by saying, you know what, they're not really inconsistent. It's just that the genetics of the population is different. And here's the specific genetic marker that can explain why this group found that coffee is good for you and another research group found that it was bad for you.
I'm laughing a little bit that you brought up coffee first. Well, it's that's your research, but also when I first got my test done, way back when it was 7 genetic markers, I remember getting my report and being so nervous about my caffeine metabolism because I was probably drinking. Okay, I was a dietitian at that point as well, probably 8 cups a day. Probably 8 cups a day and not sleeping at night. And I'm a poor metabolizer. I am, like somebody else in the room, a poor metabolizer of caffeine. And yeah.
Wait, are you saying I am? Is that what my tests show?
Yeah, a little bit.
No, that can't. I can't be. I drink a lot of caffeine.
I know.
Yeah, we've got a surprise.
Risk.
Ahmed, we've got a surprise. Surprise number 1 of the day.
And it's funny because I like being a dietitian and knowing that I'm not sleeping at night. Like I knew that 8 cups of coffee per day, it was not good for me. But I didn't get motivated to make that change until I got the report back. And it was, here are your genetics. This is your genetic type. In your face, Lisa, this is what you're doing to yourself.
Well, I thought the exact same thing when Ahmed first told me about this study. And for the audience, maybe you should just describe this study that you found that there are different types of metabolizers of caffeine, and depending on the type of metabolizer you are, your risk of heart disease is variable. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we coined the term slow metabolizer of caffeine, which means that, we all have this particular enzyme that is active in our liver, and some of us have a higher functioning version of that enzyme that breaks down caffeine into water-soluble compounds that are then just eliminated in the urine. So approximately 50% of the population are what we would call slow metabolizers. And for them, they have an impaired ability to get rid of caffeine efficiently. They're still able to get rid of caffeine. It just takes them several hours longer. And so by the time the next day rolls around, they're having their next daily dose of caffeine, and caffeine is sticking around in their system much longer. And we're finding that caffeine is causing blood vessels to constrict. So it's impairing blood flow in various parts of the body to the muscles, and that's why it's impairing performance in athletes. It's also impairing blood flow to the heart, and that's why it's been linked to a higher risk of heart attack in those individuals who have the gene that make it take a little bit longer to get rid of caffeine.
See, isn't that interesting? Because I would think the average person thinks the opposite, that they require caffeine in order to improve performance, and probably because of the neurologic effects of caffeine as a stimulant. But I guess people wouldn't necessarily think about the rest of the effects of caffeine on their body and on specifically on muscle and muscle metabolism.
And for some people, they will benefit in terms of performance, sport performance. Not you and I, but some other potential people could.
Yeah, and that's actually a study that we published about 3 years ago. And it got quite a bit of media attention. It was featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the London Times in the UK as well, where those who have, so caffeine definitely is used widely among, especially endurance athletes, as an ergogenic aid because it does improve endurance performance, largely by affecting a person's perceived rate of exertion. So you just feel less tired, right? You're more jacked and you're going to, you're able to perform better. But that turns out to be the case mostly in those who are fast metabolizers. So they get that quick buzz of caffeine, but then they get rid of it in time so that it's not impairing blood flow to the heart or to the muscles, rather, the heart as well. Whereas in the slow metabolizers, even though they still get some of that stimulating effect of caffeine that might make them feel that they can, go a little bit harder, because it's impairing blood flow to their muscle, they're actually not able to perform better, and they actually perform worse. And so that's another example of where, yeah, caffeine does improve performance in a lot of people, but it actually impairs performance in someone else. A lot of athletes just do it by trial and error, but they're often changing a bunch of other things. And we tested this using a randomized controlled clinical trial, double-blinded. The researchers, our team, did not know who was getting caffeine until the very end, and the athletes themselves didn't know if they were getting the placebo or